Hello, fellow foodies. This week on the show, we're going to dive into some big questions about food. How do we know that food is food? Is Italian olive oil really olive oil, or is it something else? And I have the perfect guest for this topic. We have Matt Siegel on the line. He has written about food and culture for publications including The Atlantic, the Fast Company, and the Paris Review. He's a former English professor and lives in Richmond, Virginia with his dog, who has the cutest name ever. His name is Waffles. We're going to talk about his new book, The History of Food, that will be coming out very soon on August 31st. So it's so great to have you here on the show, Matt. How are things going?
Things are going great. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Well, let's start with just a simple question. What kind of led you to write a book on this particular topic?
Yeah, I didn't set out to do that. So I was an English professor. So I love irony and storytelling and symbolism and looking really, really obnoxiously close at things, including text and research. But I'm equally obsessed with food, maybe more obsessed with food. So I really didn't set out to write this book. My two hobbies just sort of collided, and I ended up just spending my weekends in library basements and archives and literally checking out books by the duffel bag for my own interests. And what I really quickly realized was that the truth about food is consistently stranger than fiction. It just, a lot of it really sounds made up. And, despite all of these food shows and blogs and books, which I love, no one seemed to be talking about the things that I was finding. So really, I just started writing notes, and eventually it became a book.
That's great. Well, speaking of weird ways that food has been used, you touch on the topic of food as weapons. Let's start there.
Yeah. So sadly, I have a whole chapter dedicated to this, and then I touch on it on several chapters because it's so ubiquitous. Sadly, food has been weaponized a lot historically and a lot in the present day. Going back in history, on probably the most basic level, foods were just used as projectiles. So beehives, hot cooking oil, chili powder, these are all things you really don't want to get hit with, right? It's a step up from sticks and stones. But then you've got more creative uses. So back to beehives and honey. Level one is just sort of throwing a beehive or catapulting it or dropping it off a castle wall if someone's trying to lay siege, or maybe rigging it with a firecracker so it explodes and releases swarms of angry bees if someone trips a wire. That was done in Vietnam. Level two, a little more sadistic, is capturing your enemy and smearing them in honey to attract stinging and egg-laying insects. And level three, if you have the means and some more time on your hands, is to get a hold of some psychedelic honey and gift it to your enemies and then wait until they hallucinate and attack them while they're hallucinating. That's sort of the Wile E. Coyote method.
Yeah.
So you have all these crazy uses of food in war. There are many, many more, but by far the most effective and probably widespread use is just to take it from your enemy, either by destroying their crops or poisoning their wells. The basic idea being that if your enemy can't eat, they can't march or they can't fight. And when you add modern technology to the picture, you can get a lot more dangerous. So I don't want to talk too much about making bombs on the internet, but during World War II, the United States actually had what they called a Fat Salvage Committee, which is where they solicited salvaged cooking fats from everyday American households to turn into bombs and munitions to be used overseas. So we were literally turning bacon and bacon grease into bombs.
I had no idea that was even possible. Wow.
Yeah, there's some sort of creepy rhetoric or propaganda, but not just propaganda, instructional videos. So if you do some searching, there's some Walt Disney cartoons floating around. The Walt Disney Company was hired by the Department of Defense to create a video soliciting these used fats and instructing American households how to collect them and screen them and why it's important to do it for the country. Those are sort of some eerie videos to watch. Again, things that sound made up. On the bright side, there's all some sort of dark things, obviously, with war. On the bright side, something I write about in the book is that food is also used for morale and to remind soldiers of home. So again, on the most basic level, food is calories, it's energy, right? During war, you always have rationing programs so you can ensure that troops have literally the fuel to march. But beyond that, morale is super important. So I write a lot specifically back to World War II about the United States' use of ice cream during World War II to build morale and remind soldiers of their comforts of home. And what's most remarkable is this was during a time when sugar and all of the supplies were in super short supply. Just about every other country in the world banned ice cream or rationed it as part of their rationing programs. But the United States doubled down, literally building $1 million ice cream barges that trolled the Pacific, delivering ice cream to smaller ships, building pop-up ice cream factories on the front lines, shipping hundreds of millions of pounds of ice cream mix during the war. It was really a very intentional effort to supply ice cream at a crazy expense for the sole purpose of reminding our soldiers of home and what they were fighting for and providing that ultimate comfort food. That's the same comfort food that people eat when they have dental surgery or go through a bad breakup.
Yeah. Well, and this topic of you are what you eat is another concept that you get into the book. What can you tell us about that and how like the psychology and social structure, how all of that kind of comes together?
Yeah, so this unfolds really throughout the book. I mean, my whole point is that food is really not just a food; it's an invisible hand that really affects who we are socially, psychologically, economically. But if you just look at the idea of you are what you eat, it's a belief you find across cultures that we are what we eat. That goes back to antiquity. So one of my favorite examples is human breast milk. A lot of cultures used to believe that things like intelligence and personality traits were passed on through breast milk. So they actually used to screen wet nurses for things like emotional stability, manners, and breast shape, gambling addictions, laziness. These were all their literal texts on this. And you definitely didn't want to drink animal milk because that would have made you act like an animal. Now, today we know that's probably not true, but it's really not that far off. So in today's world, a lot of people define who they are by their food preferences, particularly on Instagram. Whether you drink pumpkin spice lattes or craft beer is, for a lot of people, it's a social currency. It's a metric they use to define themselves as individuals with good taste or worldly palate. But what we're finding out is that these individual food preferences actually have a lot to do with their foods our parents and our grandparents ate. So there's evidence, for example, that a lot of our adult food preferences go back to the foods our mothers ate during pregnancy, which, back to breast milk, go on to flavor not only her breast milk, but also her amniotic fluid. So There are studies that show that infants whose mothers consumed carrot milk, whose mothers consumed carrot juice during pregnancy and lactation, they showed a greater preference for carrot-flavored cereal. Another study showed that adults who earlier had been raised on vanilla-flavored infant formula had a greater preference as adults for vanilla-flavored ketchup. You've probably also heard that children who were breastfed tend to be more adventurous eaters, and that's because they're exposed to these absorbed flavors early on.
Yeah, the science of lactation is fascinating. It's an interesting emerging area of science. Earlier this year, we interviewed Dr. Bruce German, who works on kind of the gut microbiome in breast milk, and it was his group that found that there are ingredients in breast milk that actually are specifically made to feed the microbiota, not necessarily absorbed by the baby itself, but feeding those gut microbes. It's such an interesting, fascinating area of research, and it's surprising how little we still know about like the most fundamental source of human food from infancy.
We are, and again, there's still debates going on, about breast milk versus infant formula and nutrients, and we're still learning all of these things, and really that's just, that's really the most recent, a recent example. But if we go way back in time, the changes are more profound. So. Particularly if we look at the advent of cooking, our ancestors, they used to have these massive jaws and teeth and jaw muscles. They looked like nutcrackers. And this is because they really spent their days chewing raw tubers and raw potatoes and raw meat, hard things. But then when we learned to cook our foods, we made them a lot softer. Think about the difference between a raw potato and a cooked potato. So as a result, over the years as we evolved, our jaw muscles shrunk massively. And even though that happened a long time ago, there's evidence that you can see that our jaw muscles are still continuing to shrink even today as cultures eat more and more processed foods, which are softer. And even not that long ago, the invention and widespread use of the fork and knife also changed the shape of our jaw and teeth because we were able to cut our food into smaller pieces, and all about putting less pressure on the jaw. We don't need these massive muscles anymore. On sort of the opposite sides on the spectrum, so cooking shrunk our jaws, but it gave us much bigger brains. So by cooking our food, we unlocked a lot of nutrients and made them more easier to digest and utilize, which fueled the human brain, which is a really expensive body part. So over time, our eating cooked foods is directly responsible for a lot of human intelligence and the size of the human brain. And what's a bigger game changer than that?
Yeah, no, it's a huge game changer. I teach a class called Food Health and Society, and we get into what we call technological processing of foods. When you think about food technologies today, it's very different from like the basic technologies. We're talking about the use of heat and how, at first we could only roast foods, right? Because they didn't have containers to boil in, and really having a container that you could boil something in water also changed things. And then all the fermentation technologies that came about, a lot of these foods, can be stored longer term with fermentation. There's just so many interesting moments in history that transform the way that our diets were formed.
Yeah, agriculture is another one. Fruits and vegetables, they're not the same they were 1,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago or 100 years ago. And it's not just one change. There are all sorts of changes that on one side, a lot of fruits and vegetables used to be toxic or just super bitter. So we wouldn't eat them. And through agriculture and selective breeding, we bred them so that they were more suitable for us to eat. And that's a happy story. On the other side, we can also make foods a lot less nutritious through agriculture.
Yeah. I mean, the classic example is probably corn, right? Started off itty bitty little corn cob, tinier than your little pinky finger, and now large, full of sweet, rich in sugars, but low in some of those defense compounds that can also have health benefits.
Yeah, corn was a weed. I mean, it's mind-blowing to try and wrap your head around it's always interesting to think, who thought to eat those berries or who thought to eat those fruits, who thought to eat an oyster, right? I mean, that's not the most appetizing thing if you've never had one. But corn is probably the most bizarre because corn looked nothing like what it is today. It was a weed. It was a super, super small weed. And it had maybe 6 to 8 kernels, if you can call them kernels. They were more like pebbles. It was very hard, not very nutritious, not easy at all to chew or eat. We're really not sure what the first people who ate the ancient ancestors of corn did with it. There's not much you can do with it, but they had faith in it, so they kept replanting it and choosing only the seeds with the most attractive traits and tenderness and size. And ultimately we transformed a lowly weed from something the size of a cigarette, maybe, that had 6 or 8 kernels, to today, we all know the ear of corn. I think the kernels are 600 to 800, maybe more.
Yeah. I mean, as someone that's looked into the history of food, what do you think people in the future are going to look back? Let's say 500 years from now, assuming we can make it past the climate crisis. It's like, what do you think people will look back on this era and think about our current food systems?
I mean, I think they're going to look back at us, one thing I write about in the book, there's a lot of things that we can look back on as comical, right? So today, 2 of our most popular vegetables are tomatoes and potatoes. Not that long ago, people used to think that tomatoes were poisonous and that potatoes caused syphilis. So that's sort of comical to look at. We can scratch our heads and think, man, what were they thinking? They thought, they thought tomatoes were poisonous. I think our ancestors are going to look back at us at the exact same way. There's a lot of things we're doing that are pretty silly. We're going to find out that there's a lot that's wrong. I mean, we're still trying to figure things out. There are bright sides to what we do. I think it's going to be interesting what our ancestors look like. I think if we go way into the future, I think those jaws are going to continue to shrink. And I think it's kind of funny if you look at all the sci-fi examples of aliens and these cultures way in the future, they've got these tiny jaws and tiny, tiny mouths. And they probably discovered cooking and probably are eating a lot less and not really gnawing on animal bones. So I think those changes are going to continue.
That's great. Well, there was one plant in your book that I really enjoyed reading about, and it's something that has, started off in Mesoamerica. It's now cultivated in other places, but now we actually get this flavoring from things as banal as like basically, wood scraps. And I'm talking about vanilla, and how vanilla has also become this huge like social concept as well. What can you share with us about your research on vanilla?
Yeah, it's so unfortunate and ironic that vanilla has become a synonym for plain or ordinary, because it's really anything but. For starters, vanilla is the world's second most expensive spice.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because it grows on orchids, which is interesting enough. That can take years to bloom. They only bloom for a few hours. The orchids only grow in select areas, 25-ish degrees north or south of the equator. And they have to be pollinated by hand using a technique developed by a 12-year-old slave. And then they have to be hand massaged and cured and tucked into bed at night. So it is one of the hardest plants to cultivate out there. It's vanilla in nature has a very low chance of being pollinated. So even today, all of this has to take place by hand. It's very arduous. It takes a long time, and it's very expensive. Another line here is vanilla got its name from Spanish conquistadors who named it after a female sex part. Just something that, again, most other ice cream flavors probably can't claim that. Their history is nowhere near as interesting or exotic as vanilla. Mm-hmm. And what's really sad is that most of the people who call vanilla ordinary have probably never had it. As you mentioned, because vanilla is so expensive and so hard to cultivate and results in so little extractable flavor, up to 99% of the vanilla flavoring in foods is artificial. And it's extracted and derived from all sorts of things, wood pulp. I think vanilla, its name has been unfortunately given a bad connotation. Even the flavor, it'd be great if more people were able to taste real vanilla.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting because it is such a ubiquitous, I guess, flavoring used in so many different products. You mentioned its integration even into baby formula. It's in adult drinks as well, and sodas. It's in lots of desserts, and it's interesting because when we think of vanilla flavoring or vanilla scented candles, that's just due to one compound, as you said, that's derived synthetically, vanillin. But what makes vanilla the complex, it's all that complex chemistry in the pod that you just don't find through these synthetic means. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very, your vanilla candle is not the same as a vanilla pod, and even the vanilla flavoring you find in foods. And yeah, you make a great point there. Part of the reason vanilla was slandered as ordinary is because it is ubiquitous, but that's sort of the point. Despite all of these things, vanilla is still usually, these studies are all different, but most surveys say vanilla is still the most popular flavor of ice cream. And if you can get your hands on some real vanilla ice cream, it's a game changer. It's worth it.
Great. Well, speaking of ice cream and vanilla, and I mean, I love chocolate ice cream too. It's like, foods also have impacts on our emotions and the way that we feel. So in your book, you cover this topic too of, are some of our modern food choices making us happier or more miserable? What can you share about that?
Yeah, we talk so much about how foods affect us physically. I don't think we talk enough about the ways that they affect us emotionally. And you can go down, a bunch of different routes here. Something that's concerning to me that I write about is that we've really created these impossible standards for foods within the last few decades. So we can buy fruits and vegetables out of season, and they always look perfect because the ugly ones are thrown away, and things are applied to make the other ones look even more pretty. Mm-hmm. We can buy things like fat-free ice cream, zero-calorie soda, pre-sliced apple wedges in plastic bags, and customize our coffee literally tens of thousands of different ways at Starbucks and choose from more than 50 different types of Oreos.
Mm.
Now, at first, that sounds good. That sounds great. I mean, we love food. You mentioned you love chocolate, so do I. That's great. I think at first glance, it sounds great that we have so much choice and so much convenience. But I think if you dig deeper, we've created sort of a monster. So we've created a level of variety and perfection and convenience that we can't find anywhere else in life. So really, we've taken the idea of having it our way too far. And there's actually research that suggests that having too many choices actually makes us unhappy clinically. So the basic idea is that when we're faced with so many choices, we always imagine that there has to be a better choice out there. So we're never happy. We're never happy with the present. We sort of become paralyzed by our choices and, always want or expect that we might have made the wrong choice. And maybe there's something better out there that we have to keep searching for. And the same thing sort of goes with the ways that foods are depicted online and TV. I mentioned earlier seeing perfect vegetables in grocery stores. On TV and Instagram, it's even worse. We're exposed to these perfect magical dishes, and we often don't see the magic of TV behind them and the teams of people it makes for them to look like that. We just see this unattainable image that most of us are never going to be able to match ourselves.
Yeah.
It's sort of the same thing that happens with body image and photoshopping models. It's happening with our food, and that transfers elsewhere in life. If we have fat-free ice cream, I think suddenly we start to expect fat-free thighs and fat-free abdomens. it's
You need sugar-free ice cream for that. Well, this whole topic of images, brings back some personal experiences, and I'm sure many in the audience have had this as well. If you see on the billboard this beautiful, juicy hamburger and fries from the drive-through, and you go through and you're like expecting this gorgeous presentation of food, and you get it and it's kind of smushed in this wrapper and it's kind of lopsided and falling out and not at all delicious as you had hoped it would be. I think this happens a lot.
Yeah, it sets us up for disappointment, and it might seem comical, but really, I mean, if you think about the dangers of social media, it's the same thing is happening with our food, and it's part of social media, but it's also part of the grocery store. I think to some degree, choices are great. We all love choices, but we all love convenience too. But if our breakfast is consistently this perfect, super, super perfect, super easy, super sweet, I think the problem is that the rest of our day is going to seem a lot more bitter in comparison. Not everything is that easy. Not everything is so homogenized.
Yeah, and at the same time, there seems to be such a desire for that perfection in food. I'm thinking, just looking through Instagram at food pictures, there are hashtags like food porn, and it's just picture after picture of this beautiful, setup of foods that again are not realistic in real life, for most of us that are trying to cook in the kitchen. Did you find anything else in your research around this kind of phenomenon of of sharing images of food and how that kind of impacts us? Or is it kind of along the same track as what we see with commercial portrayals of food?
Yeah, I mean, I think your point about Instagram is right. Look, I love seeing dishes on Instagram. I save a lot. I'm inspired, and I say, hey, I'm gonna try and have something close to that tonight. So yeah, that's great. But I think there is, I think it just can be exhausting when you're constantly striving for something you think is real and looks easy. But in some cases, it's not real, and it's so far from easy. And I don't think it's not. I think in some cases it hurts us to strive for those things. I mean, there's nothing wrong with making an ugly sandwich. I've had a lot of delicious ugly sandwiches.
Yeah.
And so I would love it. I love, going out to a fine dining restaurant that has, where they prepare it with tweezers. That's great, but I don't want that in every meal. I think learning to be happy with an ugly sandwich is sort of in the same sphere as learning to be happy with yourself and your life and in your house and
Yeah.
it's that whole just keeping up with the Joneses thing.
Yeah.
And on another level, what's going on with throwing out all these ugly foods? That's a huge problem. It's getting better. There are some companies that are great companies that are selling these rejected fruits and vegetables, and sometimes they're used in things like soups. But yeah, there are plenty of reports of farmers who work really hard to grow crops, and they're rejected because they're not pretty enough and their curves aren't right, or they have blemishes. And so there are really a lot of eerie, you mentioned food porn, there are a lot of eerie similarities between the way we treat food and the way we treat, models and body image.
Yeah, that's a great point. And your point you brought up earlier also about prepackaged sliced apples, or I've even seen the store, bananas wrapped in plastic wrap. I'm like, why? Why do we, or if you go, right now it's watermelon season. If you go to the store, you find your whole watermelon, and then for probably triple the price, you can get a little thing of sliced up, pre-sliced watermelon. And part of its presentation, part of it is this perception of convenience. But it's a strange phenomenon in my mind when I see these things.
I think it's hard to defend those. So, with some other topics, it's a lot tougher. There are food deserts in the country where it's hard to get a hold of fresh foods and nutritious foods, and there's a cost barrier, right? Eating the way you want to eat, whether it's ethically or organically, sustainably, can be expensive, and that's unfortunate. So, some of those issues aren't so cut and dry. Pre-sliced apples in plastic bags, yeah, I'm not going to defend that. I think there's a lot of things wrong with that. Not only is it wasteful, but again, it's, there's there's just, you think about the whole mindfulness movement and, we are what we eat. I think we could all maybe slow down a little bit, and biting into an apple is okay.
Yeah, we can use
less cool.
We can use what jaw material we still have to chew.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I would hate to see a future where we all have small jaws because we're eating everything out of plastic containers or drinking some juice that is supposed to be a meal replacement.
I think there's a sci-fi movie in the making right there. Well, let's talk a bit more about childhood nutrition is a topic of interest to me, and I thinking about apples sliced in plastic bags and some of the policies, the federal policies we have in the United States around how the USDA and the FDA determines or defines what is food and what categories of food it goes into. A couple of years ago, of course, there was that case where they were saying that the tomato sauce, which by the way is sweetened with corn syrup, that goes onto the school pizza is considered a vegetable. What can you share with us about this general topic?
I mean, it's the wild, wild west. It's the wild, wild west, and unfortunately, sugary foods and a lot of unhealthy choices are marketed toward children specifically. It's sort of easy, right? But it's not just children. I think adults have the same problem. And just because, if you're an adult and you choose to eat, a so-called adult cereal instead of one with marshmallows and a cartoon character on the front, that doesn't mean it's necessarily any healthier.
Mm-hmm.
I talk in the book about how I mentioned earlier how for hundreds of years people thought tomatoes were poisonous and potatoes caused syphilis. And the sad reality is not that much has changed. The knowledge of nutrition is super, super clouded and confusing, and there are a lot of unknowns. One thing I write about is that the top scientists in the world still can't agree on whether or not eggs are good for us. And that's a problem. Eggs are either the best thing ever or the worst thing ever, or it doesn't matter. And I'm not referring here to old sources. I mean present day studies, books by doctors they're putting out now. There's a lot of disagreement. And so as consumers, it makes it really hard for us to figure out what to feed our kids or what to feed ourselves. And, if you look at the USDA's dietary guidelines, unfortunately, you really need decoder glasses to try and figure out what's supposedly healthy. So, they used to demonize cholesterol, for example, and then a few years ago, they dropped the upper limit for dietary cholesterol. Except they really didn't. So there's no longer a black and white dietary limit. But if you really look at their long, confusing guidelines of what is healthy, and if you add everything up, actually nothing has changed. If you do the math, the dietary limit for cholesterol put out by the USDA is the same as it was years ago before they removed it. And not only do we, I don't want to blame them completely. Not only is the science is very confusing. Not all foods are equal. Our bodies are different.
Yeah.
Eggs aren't the same probably for everyone, right? Diets work differently for different people. So the science is contested, but the USDA is also sort of programmed to fail. So it's responsible both for the interests of American farmers and meat producers and food producers, but also the nutritional interests of Americans. So on one hand, they have to tell us to buy more meat and dairy and other foods, and then on the other hand, to eat less of them. So it's very confusing. And even if you could make sense of their guidelines and figure out what's supposedly healthy, labels are not very transparent. They're very confusing. And, a lot of the guidelines are very hard to enforce. The FDA and USDA, they just do not have the bandwidth or the ability to do, I think, what they would like to. So unfortunately, it is still the wild, wild west out there. And I think that's sort of the bright side of reading this book. I get into a lot of dark things in history. And by the way, this is nothing new. All of these things used to go on, back in the day with nutrition and it certainly wasn't easier to figure out what was healthy back then. But I think if there is a silver lining, there are ways you can educate ourselves now, and it's not easy. But I think just learning some of these concepts and looking at your labels and knowing what means what vanilla flavoring means. Not that that's not a health issue, but it's very easy to see, French vanilla ice cream and think it's made with real vanilla when it's not.
Yeah. Well, it's a great point. Well, and it is a bit of the Wild West because there's so much control in the hands of industry and lobbyists that really drive a lot of policy today. But as you said, I think there are resources out there for those that want to learn more. And I think, I'm a big believer in to better prepare ourselves for the future, we have to understand the past. And that's why I really enjoyed your book. And yeah, and I can't wait for others to read it as well.
Thank
Tell
you.
us, yeah, tell us where can folks go to get the book? Again, it'll be out on August 31st.
It'll be out everywhere August 31st, and it's available to pre-order now from all of your bookstores, online or in person.
Great, great. And where else can they find information on you? Do you have a website for the book?
I have a website. It's matt-siegel.com, matt-siegel. And yeah, you can find some information there, or just Google. It's on Echo's
Great.
website and all the bookstores.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show, Matt. This is a lot of fun.
Thank you for having me. This was great.
Yeah. You've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious, recorded on Skype. You can find this episode and all of our others at foodiepharmacology.com. You can also check out the video for this episode at the Teach Ethnobotany YouTube channel under the Foodie Pharmacology playlist. Thanks so much to our producers, to Rob Cohen and Christine Roth, for their help with the show. And thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in every week. Stay healthy out there, and I'll see you next time.